Imagine standing in total darkness. You have just died. You do not remember how. You do not remember the last breath you took. But you can feel your body, or something like a body, and you can sense that you are no longer in the world you knew. In front of you, a figure steps out of the darkness. He is tall. He is lean. His body is the body of a man, but his head is the head of a black jackal, and his eyes glow with a pale gold light. In his hand, he carries a set of golden scales. "Come," he says. "It is time. This is Anubis." And according to the ancient Egyptians, he was the first thing every dead person saw on the other side. Not a bright light. Not a tunnel. Not a loving voice. A silent god with the head of a scavenger, escorting you toward a trial that would determine what happened to your soul for eternity. And here is what most people get wrong about Anubis. He was not evil. He was not a grim reaper who enjoyed death. He was a gentle god. A fair one. In ancient Egyptian belief, he invented the rituals of mummification to protect the dead. He guided souls with patience and care. He weighed hearts with perfect honesty. He was terrifying only in the sense that truth is terrifying. And in ancient Egypt, there was no god the living feared more and no god the dead respected more than the jackal-headed lord of the Duat. The birth story of Anubis is tangled, and that's not an accident. There are at least 3 versions, each one contradicting the others. The oldest accounts, from the pyramid texts written around 2400 BC, describe Anubis simply as the son of Ra, the sun god himself. He was the 4th son of Ra, and he was given dominion over the dead from the very beginning, when the world was still young and death was still a new invention. But later myths, from the time of the New Kingdom around 1500 BC, tell a different story. In this version, Anubis was the son of Osiris, the god-king of Egypt, and his sister Nephthys. The problem was that Nephthys was married to Set, Osiris's brother, the god of chaos and desert storms. And Osiris was married to Isis, the most powerful goddess in the pantheon. Nephthys disguised herself as Isis one night, seduced Osiris, and became pregnant with Anubis. When Anubis was born, Nephthys was terrified that Set would discover the betrayal and kill the child. So she abandoned Anubis in the desert. He was found by Isis, who, despite having every reason to resent the child of her husband's affair, took Anubis in and raised him as her own. She became his adoptive mother. And Anubis became fiercely loyal to Isis for the rest of his existence. This is important because it means that Anubis grew up in 2 worlds. He was the biological son of a god of chaos, through his stepfather Set, and a god of order, through his father Osiris. He was raised by the goddess whose entire mission was to defend her husband and restore cosmic balance. He was a creature of the desert who became a creature of the tomb. And every duality in his life prepared him for the role he would eventually play, judging the dead, where both order and chaos meet. Why a jackal? Of all the animals in Egypt, the mighty lion, the regal falcon, the sacred ibis, why did the god of death take the form of a scavenger that dug up graves? The answer is as practical as it is unsettling. In ancient Egypt, before the perfection of mummification, the dead were often buried in shallow desert graves. And jackals, with their keen sense of smell and their preference for carrion, were the animals most often seen digging up those graves at night to feed on the bodies. The Egyptians could not stop the jackals. But they could make a choice. They could see the jackal as a desecrator, or they could make the jackal a protector. They chose the second path. They reasoned that if the god of death himself had the form of a jackal, then jackals were no longer enemies of the dead. They were guardians. Every scavenger digging at a grave was, in some sense, a manifestation of Anubis himself, checking on the buried. Reinterpreting a fear as a protection is one of the oldest forms of mythology. And it gave the Egyptians enormous comfort. The creature that threatened their dead became the creature that watched over their dead. Anubis is almost always depicted as black, even though real jackals are a sandy brown color. The black was deliberate. Black was the color of the fertile silt of the Nile flood, the color of rebirth and regeneration. By painting Anubis black, the Egyptians were encoding a message: death itself is a doorway to new life. The jackal who devours is also the jackal who restores. For centuries, Anubis was the supreme god of the afterlife in Egyptian religion. He alone weighed hearts. He alone judged the dead. He alone decided who would pass into the fields of reeds and who would be devoured. But around 2000 BC, a new god rose to prominence in Egypt, a god whose cult was so powerful that even Anubis had to step aside. That god was Osiris. Osiris was the god-king who had been murdered by his brother Set, dismembered, and scattered across Egypt. Isis had gathered the pieces and, with help from Anubis, performed the first mummification in history, wrapping Osiris's body in linen, anointing it with oils, and performing the rituals that allowed his soul to return to his body. Osiris became the first being ever to pass from death back into existence. He became the king of the dead. And in Egyptian theology, this changed everything. Because Osiris had died and been reborn, he became the model for what every human could hope to become. Every Egyptian, at death, would be identified with Osiris. They would be called the Osiris so-and-so in their funerary texts. They would hope to repeat his journey, death, judgment, restoration, eternal life. But here is the elegant part of Egyptian mythology: instead of replacing Anubis, Osiris's rise created a partnership. Osiris became the ruler of the underworld, the king who sat on the throne in the Hall of Judgment. But Anubis remained the operational god of death. He was the one who embalmed bodies. He was the one who led souls from the grave to the Hall of Judgment. He was the one who performed the actual weighing of the heart. Osiris ruled the realm. Anubis ran it. Let me describe to you, in the most vivid terms I can, what Anubis actually did to the bodies of the dead. Because modern people tend to think of mummification as a quaint Egyptian custom. It was not. It was one of the most elaborate and theologically significant rituals ever developed by any civilization. The process took 70 days. 70. Not because it physically required that long, it didn't, but because 70 days was the length of time that the star Sirius disappeared from the sky each year before reappearing. The mummification was timed to echo the death and rebirth of a star. First, the priests removed the internal organs through a small incision in the left side of the abdomen. The lungs, liver, stomach, and intestines were placed in 4 sacred jars called the canopic jars, each jar guarded by one of the 4 sons of Horus. The heart, however, was left inside the body. The Egyptians believed the heart was the seat of intelligence, emotion, and soul. Removing it would be removing the person themselves. Next, the brain was removed through the nose using a long iron hook. This is not an exaggeration. The Egyptians believed the brain was unimportant, a kind of mucus factory, and they disposed of it without ceremony. Then the body was covered in natron, a naturally occurring salt, and left to dry for 40 days. After the body had completely dried out, it was washed, anointed with oils, and wrapped in hundreds of yards of linen strips. Amulets were placed between the layers to protect the body from evil in the afterlife. And throughout all of this, the chief priest performing the mummification wore a mask. The mask of Anubis. A jackal-headed mask. Because in that moment, the priest was not a man performing a ritual. The priest was Anubis himself, physically present in the embalming chamber, performing the sacred rites that would prepare the dead for their journey. Once the body was prepared, the real journey began. The soul, which the Egyptians divided into several parts, including the Ba and the Ka, had to travel through the Duat, the Egyptian underworld. The Duat was not a simple place. It was a labyrinth. A dark realm of caverns, rivers, gates, and guardians. Each section was ruled by a different deity, and each had to be navigated carefully. Souls who knew the right prayers and spells, often copied from the Book of the Dead and buried with them, could find their way through. Souls who did not were lost forever. At the center of the Duat was the Hall of Two Truths, also called the Hall of Mot. Mot was the goddess of truth, justice, and cosmic order. She was depicted as a woman with a single ostrich feather in her hair. The feather was her symbol. And that feather was about to become the most important object in every dead soul's existence. The Hall of Two Truths was exactly what it sounds like, a place where two things would be measured against each other. On one side of a great golden scale, the feather of Mot. On the other side, the heart of the dead person. The heart, remember, was the seat of everything the person had ever been. Their thoughts, their actions, their secrets, their love, their cruelty. All of it was stored in the heart. And all of it was about to be weighed against a single feather. The god standing beside the scale, making sure the weighing was fair, was Anubis. This is the central image of Egyptian religion. The moment that every Egyptian feared and prepared for their entire life. Picture it. The vast hall. The towering pillars. The god Osiris on his throne at the far end, watching silently. Thoth, the god of writing, standing with a reed pen and a scroll, ready to record the verdict. And Anubis, the jackal-headed god, crouched beside the scale, his hands on the pivot, ensuring that the measurement would be absolutely accurate. The dead person would be led into the hall. They would stand before the scale. And Anubis would place their heart on one side and the feather of Mot on the other. If the heart was lighter than the feather, meaning the person had lived a life of honesty, kindness, and cosmic balance, the scale would remain level or the heart would rise. This was a pass. The soul would be declared true of voice and would move on to Osiris, who would welcome them into the afterlife. They would enter the field of reeds, an idealized version of Egypt where the Nile flowed perfectly and the crops grew endlessly, and they would be reunited with their loved ones forever. But if the heart was heavier than the feather, meaning the person's life had been weighed down with lies, cruelty, or violations of Mot, then the heart would drop. It would sink below the feather. And the soul would fail the test. And here is where it gets horrifying. Because failure in the Hall of Two Truths was not a slap on the wrist. It was annihilation. Beside the scale, always watching, was a creature that the Egyptians called Ammit, the devourer of the dead, or soul eater. Ammit was not a god. Ammit was a hybrid monster composed of the three most dangerous animals known to the ancient Egyptians. She had the head of a crocodile, the front legs and body of a lion or leopard, and the hindquarters of a hippopotamus. Think about that combination for a moment. Three animals that, in ancient Egypt, were considered the three most lethal predators a human could encounter. The Egyptians had distilled their fears of death into a single creature, and that creature sat at the foot of the scale of judgment, waiting. If the heart failed the weighing, if it was heavier than the feather, Anubis would take it from the scale and throw it to Ammit. Ammit would eat it. And the soul whose heart was devoured would cease to exist. Not go to a hell. Not suffer eternal torment. Simply, stop. Be unmade. For the Egyptians, this was the worst possible fate. Worse than any imagined hell. Because in Egyptian theology, existence itself was the gift. To be remembered, to have a name, to be spoken of by the living, that was immortality. To be devoured by Ammit meant that your name was erased, your memory dissolved, and your soul returned to the void from which all things had come. This is why Egyptians prepared for death their entire lives. They commissioned tombs, they learned the spells of the Book of the Dead, they performed rituals, they gave offerings to Anubis, all to ensure that when their heart was placed on that scale, it would be light enough to pass. There is one more layer to the trial that most retellings leave out. The weighing of the heart was not the only test. Before the heart was even placed on the scale, the dead person had to recite the negative confession in front of 42 judges. The 42 judges were minor gods who each represented a different sin. And the dead person had to stand before each of them, in turn, and declare what they had not done. Not what they had done, what they had not done. The Egyptians understood something profound about morality. Evil is usually defined not by what you do, but by what you fail to avoid. The negative confession went something like this: I have not committed murder. I have not stolen. I have not lied. I have not blasphemed. I have not oppressed the poor. I have not made anyone weep. I have not defiled the temple of a god. I have not caused any man to hunger. I have not caused any man to fear. I have not polluted the river. 42 declarations. Each one had to be made in front of a different judge, who was named and who specifically governed that particular sin. And the Egyptians believed these gods could detect a lie. If you had murdered someone and tried to claim you had not, the weighing of your heart would catch you. Because the heart, remember, contained everything. Only after all 42 declarations were made did the heart go onto the scale. And only after the scale declared the heart true of voice, did Anubis lead the soul forward into the presence of Osiris. For those souls who passed the test, the reward was the field of reeds, Aru in Egyptian, sometimes also called the field of offerings. This was the Egyptian heaven. But it was not an abstract realm of light and clouds. It was a specific, tangible, almost suspiciously familiar place. The field of reeds was an idealized version of Egypt itself. Fertile fields stretched as far as the eye could see. The Nile flowed in perfect abundance. Crops grew to impossible heights. The weather was perpetually mild. There were houses, and families, and food, and drink, and rest. Souls who entered the field of reeds were reunited with their loved ones who had already died. They could continue their lives, not as disembodied spirits, but as restored beings, eating and drinking and farming and loving. There is something beautiful and something strange about this vision of paradise. The Egyptians did not imagine an afterlife that was radically different from earthly life. They imagined an afterlife that was earthly life, perfected. To an Egyptian, the best possible eternity was to wake up every morning in a fertile field by a calm Nile, with family around you, and spend the day working the land and enjoying the harvest. Forever. That was enough. And Anubis, who had guided them through the terror of the duat, who had stood beside the scale as their heart was weighed, who had spoken their name in front of Osiris. Anubis was the one who opened the gate to the field of reeds and let them walk through. Ancient Egyptian religion is one of the oldest recorded systems of thought in human history. It predates Christianity by thousands of years. It predates Buddhism. It predates the writing of the Hebrew Bible. And at the center of its vision of death and justice stood a gentle, jackal-headed god who weighed hearts against a feather. Why does Anubis still matter? Because his story contains one of the most humane visions of moral judgment ever imagined. There is no arbitrary god throwing lightning bolts. There is no grim accountant tallying sins in a ledger. There is only a silent, fair God with a perfect scale, and your own heart placed against the weight of a single feather. The only thing that mattered, at the end, was what you had actually been. Not what you had claimed. Not what you had pretended. Not what others had thought of you. Just the truth of your heart, weighed against the truth of the cosmos. The Egyptians understood something that many religions since have forgotten. Morality is not a performance. It is not a confession. It is not a negotiation. It is a weight that you build, choice by choice, inside yourself. And at the end, when you stand in the hall of two truths, there is no one to lie to and no one to bargain with. There is only the feather. There is only the scale. There is only Anubis, watching without judgment, to see which way your heart will fall. What mythology should we explore next? Hindu? Japanese? More Egyptian? Tell me in the comments. Subscribe to the Myth Archive. The oldest stories are still the ones that ask the hardest questions.